Good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is David Mace, and I am the cultural attaché of the Embassy of the United States in Berlin. Apologies for the delay. There was a technical problem, and I have one more word of caution, which is that the Marines here in the American Embassy are exercising and sometimes have loud announcements. So if that happens, I'm going to mute for a bit and then continue afterward. In any case, on behalf of the Embassy and consulates in Germany, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I thank Media Company, our partner, for helping to run this program. Note that you can post your questions in the chat, and we will have a Q&A in the second half of the program. This is our second fireside chat after climate activist Catherine Wilkinson joined us in September for the kickoff of Going Green, our national award-winning school project here in Germany. If you missed that discussion, you can still watch the video and the link will be posted in the chat. Today, we are thrilled to be able to present to our audiences one of the most prominent climate activists in the United States, Bill McKibben. It's an honor to...
Attention, embassy.
Apologies for that. In any case, Mr. McKibben, it's an honor to have you with us. My colleagues and I deeply appreciate your support for our efforts. Our second guest this evening is Professor Miranda Schreurs, who will be our moderator and introduce Mr. McKibben in more detail in a few minutes. Professor Schreurs is one of the leading scholars on climate change in Germany and teaches at TU München. Her main research areas are in international and comparative climate policy, environmental politics, and low-carbon energy transitions. She is examining the transitions in Germany and Japan, the climate policies of Europe, the United States, and China. In 2011, Professor Schreurs was appointed by Chancellor Angela Merkel as a member of the German Ethics Commission on a Safe Energy Supply. Professor Schreurs is also Vice Chair of the European Environment and Sustainable Development Advisory Councils. Thank you, Professor, for leading the discussion tonight. Let me briefly comment on today's topic, saving our planet, what we need to do now to combat climate challenges and secure our future. Polls consistently ranked climate action as one of the most critical issues for German voters in last month's elections. A majority of Americans also say we are doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. President Biden understands this. Hours after being sworn in as president, he rejoined the Paris Agreement. Just days later, he signed executive orders, placing climate squarely at the center of every government decision. As the president said at the United Nations General Assembly, we are fast approaching a point of no return. The most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change confirmed that climate change is impacting the planet in unprecedented ways. After a summer of extreme weather, drought and flooding, fires and hurricanes, heat waves and rising seas, the stakes have never been higher. The scope of this threat is borderless. We all must act. President Biden's Build Back Better agenda includes the goal of getting 100% of the country's electricity from clean sources by 2035. As transatlantic partners, the United States and Germany collaborate through initiatives such as the US-EU Energy Council, the Partnership for Transatlantic Energy and Climate Cooperation, and a new US-Germany Climate and Energy Partnership. Coming up soon, as we all know, is COP26 in Glasgow, the most important multilateral forum on climate. In this critical decade for action, COP26 must be a turning point. One thing is certain. Success will require tapping into the very best of global ingenuity and creativity to reach a net zero future, not just at home, but in emerging economies too. Just as important as governments, we now have a climate youth movement. Chancellor Merkel said it certainly drove us to speed up and approach the matter more resolutely. To continue to engage youth on climate, it is important to have it as a required part of the school science curriculum. Many in the audience tonight are participants in our Going Green School project. We are proud of this program, which helps German teachers and students learn more about climate change and connects young Germans and Americans on both sides of the Atlantic. But we want to reach all generations and motivate each of you to become active. How can this be done? There's no one better than Bill McKibben to inspire us. He just launched a new initiative called ThirdAct.org to tap into the rich resources that the boomers bring to the table: experience, time, and money. Now, do remember to post your questions in the chat, and I turn this over to you, Miranda Schreurs.
Thank you so much, David Mies, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and particularly a pleasure with our guest, our special guest, Bill McKibben. The accolades that go with your name are so long. I'm only going to pull a few of them out, but Bill McKibben is the Schumann Distinguished Scholar at Middlebury College and was awarded the Right Livelihood Award, one of the highest awards you can get in the realm of the civil society for activities that are really helping us move forward as a society. As well as the Gandhi Peace Prize. That's really a terrific set of awards and many others. But probably what Bill McKibben is most known for is creating 350.org, a very, very important environmental organization in the United States that has helped mobilize tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people and other people to really take on the climate change issue and address fossil fuel industries and policies that have allowed us to get into the mess that we're in. We just heard about the new initiative, the Third Act. I'm looking forward to hearing more about it. And there's also a long list of books that Bill McKibben has written. End of Nature, his first, and one of his most recent, Falter. Has the human game reached its endpoint, basically, what he's asking us here? Have we gone too far? So Bill, welcome. We're really happy to have you here. And I'm wondering if you could maybe start us off with just some of your ideas of where we are at with dealing with climate change and what do we need to do?
Well, Miranda, first of all, thank you for your life's work, and a real thank you to David and the people at the consulate. This is great fun. And greetings from Vermont, the second smallest state in the union, but we punch above our weight, and it's a beautiful day here in the mountains of New England. Look, this is one of these stock-taking moments, isn't it? We're 3 or 4 days away from the start of the Glasgow conference, which is on that list now of sort of iconic climate conferences with Kyoto, Copenhagen, and Paris. The first two failures, the second, the third, a sort of success, and now we'll see where we stand. In physical terms, obviously, where we stand is not great. I wrote the first book about climate change for a general audience, The End of Nature, way back in 1989. And sadly, the things that we were warning about in 1989 are basically coming true. We've raised the temperature of the planet a little more than 1 degree Celsius. That's proven to be enough to melt most of the Arctic, thus throwing the jet stream and the Gulf Stream into consternation. It's been enough to radically shift the way that hydrology on Earth works, the way that water moves around our home planet. We have, I mean, if you want one fact for our time. It's that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. And so in arid areas, we see evaporation and then drought and then massive fire. In wet areas, we see downpour and deluge. Sometimes we see them both. California 3-4 days ago finished its driest 12 months on record, immediately followed by the largest rainstorm in the history of the Central Valley in California. Europe saw its single biggest rainstorms ever measured. I was in New York 6 weeks ago when it had the biggest rainstorm ever measured there, and people drowned in their basement apartments when they flooded. Obviously, this is prelude. We're on a path to raise the temperature something like 3 degrees Celsius, unless we change course very quickly. And that's what the Glasgow conference and everything else that people are working on is about. Not to stop global warming, too late to do that, but to try to stop it short of the place where it destroys civilizations that our ancestors spent millennia constructing. And that's a very open question, whether that remains possible. It's completely clear that our best chance lies in moving very quickly. I think the one thing that people have come to realize, I hope, about climate change, and maybe the single most important salient political and economic fact about it is that it's a timed test. In that, it is different from the other political challenges we're used to dealing with in our countries and in our lives, most of which linger over decades, and we make some progress on and stall and maybe we backslide and make some more progress and so on. Climate change isn't like that, because the fundamental negotiation in the end isn't between Republicans and Democrats or Americans and Chinese or industry and environmentalists. The fundamental negotiation is between human beings and physics. And physics is extremely immature. It refuses to compromise. It has no interest in negotiation. It is determined to get its own way. And so it is up to us to respect that. And in this case, that means, as climate scientists have told us, that if we want to have any chance of meeting the targets we set in Paris just 6 years ago, we need to cut emissions in half by 2030. 2030 is 8 years and a little bit of loose change away. So not an easy task. But, and I'll wrap up quickly here, there are two things that should give us modest hope. One is that the scientists and engineers have really done their job, and renewable energy is now the cheapest form of energy on planet Earth. As an Oxford study a couple of weeks ago pointed out, a rapid conversion to renewable energy would save the world tens of trillions of dollars, even without factoring in the avoided cost of climate change and the economic havoc it will wreak, simply because of the fact that the sun and the wind are cheaper than coal and oil, because the energy gets delivered every morning when the sun rises above the horizon. The second thing that should make us hopeful is that over the last 10 years, as David has said, a massive movement has arisen across the world, and it's capable of pushing hard on the fossil fuel industry that is the single leading cause of our inaction. We announced on Tuesday that the fossil fuel divestment movement, which I helped to launch, 9 years ago now, has just passed the $40 trillion mark in endowments and portfolios that have agreed to divest from fossil fuel. Indeed, within hours of that announcement, the Dutch pension giant ABP, which is the 5th largest pension fund on earth, divested its $568 billion from fossil fuel. So that kind of pressure is very real and very powerful, and it needs to continue and ramp up. We're in a race. We don't know if we're going to win the race. It's the most important race there ever was. That's where we are.
So, Bill, maybe you can link what you're talking about here to what needs to be done. we have a good idea that the fossil fuel industries have been a big part of the problem, and that they've invested massively also in climate skeptic kinds of messaging, and really have done their best to block action. We have two levels to work at, the international, but also the national in the US. Can you help us understand a little bit what really needs to be done in Glasgow, and what does that mean for the US?
Well, so as we speak at the moment, the CEOs of the big oil companies are testifying before Congress for the first time. And Congress is trying to hold them account for those 3 decades of lying. And of course, they're continuing with their current posture of intense greenwashing and explaining to everyone that they understand that climate change is quite a severe problem, and if only we will leave it to them, they will figure out a series of expensive technical solutions, none of which involve the thing we really need to do and now can, which is to stop burning things here on the surface of the earth and rely instead on the fact that the good Lord put a large ball of burning flame 90 million miles away, and now we know how to make use of it. What has to happen in the US is that the power of the fossil fuel industry has to be broken enough that Congress can finally pass serious climate legislation. That power at the moment takes the form of the Republican Party, but also, sadly, of Senator Manchin of West Virginia, who Exxon lobbyists referred to as their kingmaker not long ago. And he's been the gate through which all climate legislation must pass. The news today is that it appears he's willing to let pass through a large package of tax incentives and tax credits that should spur the production of renewable energy. But it also comes with a ton of money that'll be wasted on building fanciful programs around carbon sequestration and so on and so forth, in an effort to let the fossil fuel industry think it has some kind of future. What has to happen in Glasgow is that that US willingness to pony up serious money has to be enough to allow Biden and John Kerry, his emissary, former Secretary of State, our former chief diplomat, to make progress in convincing China, India, and a handful of other key players to make ambitious announcements of their own, so that we come out of here on a path somewhat closer, we come out of Glasgow on a path closer to 2 degrees than 3. It won't be sufficient, it won't be success, it won't be the end of the story. Nothing is the end of the story. Really, what we do at each step of this process is try to get just enough done that the fight is still alive, that we have some hope.
Yeah, sorry, you just mentioned 2 degrees here. But what I hear around us here in Germany is the question about 1.5 degrees. Yes. Are you giving up on 1.5
No, not at all.
degrees?
1.5 degrees. Look, so let's begin with this. As it turns out, 1 degree is way too much. If 1 degree melts the Arctic, we're fools to find out what 1.5 is going to do. That's why I started something called 350.org, working from what the scientists actually tell us we need to do, which is reduce the level of CO2 emission, CO2 concentration in the atmosphere below 350 parts per million. And that would be enough to eventually get us back below 1 degree and headed in the right direction. At the moment, we're headed towards 3 degrees. If we do that, then we're out of luck. So what we have to hope is that we can get as close to 1.5 as still possible. We will see. I think the crucial question at the moment is not where is this all eventually going to come out. I think the crucial question for right now is what's going to happen between now and 2030. Because what worries me is that with each year that passes and each new increment of carbon in the atmosphere, we get closer to the point where we lose control of this problem, where our fingers slip, as it were, from the thermostat, and we begin to see just a series of autonomous changes that the Earth is enacting on its own. And already, obviously, some of that is underway. I mean, melting the Arctic is a big problem for many reasons, including the fact that we've now lost the nice white mirror at the top of the Earth that reflects most of the sun's incoming rays back out to space, and replaced them with blue water that absorbs that incoming radiation. But there are plenty other feedback loops that could take us in even more dramatic places. So the real questions are not about where we are 50 or 100 years from now. They're about where we are 7 or 8 years from now.
So you've really emphasized how important it is that we act, and we act soon. And I think it might be helpful for everyone here to hear a little bit about why it's so important to act now, and why not just wait until technologies improve and maybe new technologies develop and we do it a little bit later, because that's one of the arguments you often hear. So what's the real incentive to act now, and what would you prioritize?
Well, I mean, this problem is so huge that one does hope that over time we'll develop other, the technologies that are sort of in the pipeline now, maybe around direct air capture of carbon or so on and so forth. But our problem, as I've said before, is that the planet is tipping into a state of where the feedback loops that we have kicked off will make it impossible to ever control the temperature again. If we thaw out enough permafrost and release all the carbon and methane in the tundra, that'll overwhelm our ability. That'll be like doubling the number of cars we have on the road, or whatever it is. And so the biggest task right now is to take the technology we do have and deploy it at scale. And it's pretty good technology. I mean, look, it's somewhat miraculous to be alive at a moment when the cheapest way to produce electricity on planet Earth is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That's a Hogwarts scale magic, and taking full advantage of it all over the world. Sun and wind and batteries are now mature technologies, but they're getting cheaper with each passing year as well. The learning curve is still very much there, even though they're already the cheapest way to produce electricity.
Mm-hmm. So I'm getting a couple of questions sent my way from our audience, and I thought I'd share some of them with you. One area of interest seems to be around climate skepticism and the fossil fuel industry, as well as finance questions. The banks, investment funds, you've already mentioned that a little bit. But are climate skeptics still a problem? And if they are, what do we do about it?
Well, yes. I mean, the sort of outright climate denial and things is less than it used to be, but by no means disappeared. The U.S. is sort of the headquarters of it. And in fact, our last president was a manifestation of it, having declared that climate change was a hoax manufactured by the Chinese. A point of view so bizarre that if you were sitting next to someone on a public bus who was muttering that, you would get up and change your seat. But that's what happens when you have 30 years for the fossil fuel industry to spread a series of just lies, with billions of dollars behind it. The polling data, however, indicates that now even most Americans who have trailed the world in this understand that climate change is a serious problem that needs serious action. We're at something like 70%, which in today's America is a very large figure. I worry less about the 30%, partly because there's no point in worrying about them. Their opposition is rooted in ideology, and it's not going to change. You can, waiting for next week's issue of science to arrive on your doorstep so you can share around the new studies, and it isn't going to move that 30%. I worry more about getting the 70% of people who do understand that there's a problem more active and more engaged in this fight. We're coming up on Thanksgiving here in the States. And I would say, I tell people, kids, don't wreck Thanksgiving dinner arguing with your crazy uncle about climate change, because he's not going to shift. But it's worth sitting next to your sweet aunt, who probably really is worried about her grandchildren, and trying to convince her to be a little more outspoken about it, to write a letter to the editor, to make sure she's calling her congressman, to be writing her bank, asking why they're funding climate destruction, on and on.
Okay. It's what we tell everybody here too. Stay politically active, get your parents, get your friends involved. It's really important. The more we mobilize, the better. As we speak, we're seeing energy prices rising. And these are fossil fuel prices that are bringing some companies into situations where they're starting to question climate initiatives, and even countries. We're seeing China, for example, just before the Glasgow negotiations begin, questioning whether or not they're really going to be reducing their coal consumption as much. What's behind that? Do you have any idea? Why are we seeing this happening right in front of Glasgow?
Well, partly it's the strange way that the pandemic has affected supply chains and everything all over the planet. But partly it's a reflection of the shift that's underway, which won't be perfectly timed and utterly smooth, but is clearly headed in the direction of renewable energy. And that means that there's less money, less capital available for going to fund new drilling projects and things. And so the supply may be somewhat shorter of fossil fuel in the years ahead, which all in all is a good thing for two reasons. One, the less we burn, the better off we are. Two, as the price rises, it actually becomes, at this point, a compelling argument to people to make the switches in their lives that we need to make. So, gasoline is now $3.25 a gallon in the US, which for the US is high. That'll lead to grousing and complaining, but it'll also lead to a big uptake in electric car sales over the next year. Because once you've got an EV in the garage, the price of gas doesn't bother you. I've got solar panels on the roof. The car is plugged into them. I'm my own filling station, And
that's great.
And that's becoming, profoundly more possible. The most popular vehicle in America is the Ford F-150 pickup truck. It's been the biggest selling vehicle in America for the last 40 some years. An iconic machine. In the spring, Ford is releasing the electric version of this pickup truck. And they have hundreds of thousands of pre-orders for it already, because people realize that it's a better machine. I mean, if you're a carpenter working on a job site, you now are driving a giant battery that'll power your tools all day long. You're watching in Germany what's happening with the car companies, one after another, just saying we're going to retool and we're not going back. 5-10 years from now, basically all we're going to be making are electric cars because they're better cars and because we need to. So there's the transitions are never, especially unplanned, contentious ones like this, are never smooth and perfect, but that's a sign that the transition's underway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's exciting too. In fact, one of the things I like to tell my students is that they shouldn't just be depressed, because in fact, there's some really exciting transitions available, and they have the opportunity to do things a whole lot better than their parents did. But what you were talking about just now had me thinking about our conversation in the waiting time for the start of this panel. And we were beginning to talk about the infrastructure package that's going through Congress right now. And we know it's been scaled back. And there are questions about to what extent is climate still really a central element of the package. I'm sure you're not involved with all the details, but what's your take on what's going on and what does it mean for Glasgow?
Well, so let's put this in context first. The US Congress has never in 30 years adopted big climate legislation. The only other time it tried was in 2009. And that failed. It didn't even get to a vote in the Senate. And then nothing happened for a dozen years. The package that is, rumors are flying around Washington as we speak. Joe Biden was at the Capitol today trying to round up votes. The package that appears to be taking shape has removed penalties and incentives for utilities to quickly convert to renewable energy. That's too bad. That may have been the single most important part of the original package. They've replaced it with a lot of tax credits and incentives for electric vehicles, for building out solar and wind power, for building transmission grids and things to $550 billion, which is a serious commitment of funds. I think the way to think of it, I'm sure the Biden administration will spin it as a great victory, and that's what they'll be saying in Glasgow. And I think the more sober assessment will be, it's not a defeat and it's not a great victory. It's not a home run, it's a double. And it keeps us in the game. It doesn't win the game by any means, but it's, and I expect that the kind of outcome of Glasgow will be similar. People will cobble together something that moves the needle somewhat closer to 2 degrees than 3, and the process will continue. It is incredibly frustrating that it is this hard. That the world is faced with the biggest problem it's ever been faced with, and we have to beg for incremental action, especially frustrating at a time when it's no longer necessary, when the advent of cheap renewable energy means there's no real technical or financial obstacle to doing what needs doing. The things that stand in the way are, as always, vested interest and inertia, and those are powerful forces and hard to overcome.
So I have a question here from Alexander, and it goes a little bit in this direction. It's a question of whether or not the United States can be considered credible internationally, considering the gridlock we've seen. And I think you could add to this question, the whole question, the changes between one administration and the next. What stops the next administration from shifting things should there be a switch back to a more conservative government?
I mean, if we get another Trump term, then things will get completely screwed up. I mean, there's no, I can't give you any, guarantee against it. And it's very clear that America's democracy is less functional than it used to be or than it should be. And I'm afraid the same is true in other places around the world. We look at other key countries like Brazil, whose control of the Amazon rainforest means that it is one of the 3 or 4 most important players in climate outcomes. We look at Russia, which obviously has, if it's a democracy in name, that's even that's in question at this point. So look, there's no, if we get through this, it'll be by luck and by the skin of our teeth. And I wouldn't, we're working super hard to try and rebuild what we can of democracy in America. Third Act, which I've just helped launch for people over the age of 60, works on climate change and on voter suppression. And those two issues are really important, and they're really linked, because we can't get change at the scale we need if we don't have an actual working democracy.
Yeah, maybe we can add just a word here for the audience that hasn't yet heard so much about the third act. I looked it up in the internet when I heard that you were coming. Maybe you'd be willing to share a bit more what you're planning here, and where is it?
Sure. I've mostly done organizing with young people. When I started 350.org, it was myself and 7 college students. And at the time, there wasn't a lot of youth organizing going on. And now, thank heaven, there is. Everyone knows Greta is fantastic. I love working with her. But she'd be the first to say that the great news is there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs, and they have 10 million followers around the world, including amazing young leaders in Germany. I'm thinking of people like Luisa Neubauer, who if she's not chancellor inside of 15 years, then something's gone very wrong, because she's as smart and brave as anybody I've ever met. But it is not okay to demand that 17-year-olds solve this problem. They lack the political and economic strength to back up the moral and intellectual leadership that they're now exerting. And I've become convinced that it's going to be especially important for older people to be a key part of this. We have this idea, and there's some evidence to back it up, that people become more conservative as they age. That's a problem. In the US, the block of the silent generation and the baby boomers, those of us over 60, is so huge and has so much money. We're about 70% of the financial assets in the country, that if we don't move, it'll be very difficult. But I don't think that for these generations that rule about becoming more conservative necessarily applies. I think it's a distinctive set of generations. When we were young, we either participated in, or at the least bore witness to, really profound cultural, political, social transformations. The anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement in its earliest stages. And if in decades that followed, we tended to be more focused perhaps on consumerism than citizenship, okay, that is what it is. Now we emerge into our third act and our final act with resources, with skills, with grandkids, with real incentive to not leave the world a worse place than we found it, which is going to be our legacy unless things change very quickly. So that's why we're organizing older people. The reaction has been good. We will see. I think it might be especially powerful as we turn to these questions around finance. I'm going down to Boston in the morning to join with a bunch of older people who will be backing up a bunch of younger people who are taking on the banks that provide the financing for fossil fuel industry. All across America, people will be outside the doors of Chase Bank branches. Chase is the biggest bank in the world and also the biggest funder of fossil fuels. They've poured about $1/3 of $1 trillion in that direction since the Paris Climate Accords. They didn't need Donald Trump to sabotage the thing. They were willing to do it themselves. And so we need to hold them to account. And that'll be easier if we have involved the people whose money they mostly have in their vaults.
Yeah, sounds exciting, sounds terrific, inspiring, and kudos, not only 350.org, but here's the next one, the next really big one. So very exciting. I am getting question after question sent my way, and I'm going to take a couple of them here. They're questions about action. What do we need to do and at which level? So individual, local, regional, national, global. You get this question a lot about, where's the most important level for the people here in the room? What should they be thinking of?
So at the moment, Miranda, in the early days, there was a lot of emphasis on individual action. What light bulb should I have, so on. And not to downplay that. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that I've got solar panels all over the roof. That's how I'm talking with you right now. But I don't try to fool myself that that's how we're going to solve things at this point. We've waited long enough that you're not going to make the climate math work one vegan dinner at a time, one Tesla at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make basic political and economic shifts that will allow us to cut carbon fast. That's why we've built these movements. And no matter what age you are or where you are, there are movements that you can be a part of that are pushing for really serious change. Some of that on the national level and some of it on the local, state, and regional level. And also, as I was saying earlier, these movements are increasingly cognizant of the fact that political action is not the only route. There are two levers big enough to pull that matter here. One of them is marked politics and the other is marked money. And, they're connected. There's some overlap there, especially in the US where money poisons our political system, but they're distinct. And so it is as important to be taking on, Wall Street and the city and, bond and, all the kind of centers of finance in the world as it is to be taking on the political centers. We would win.
So be political and think of where you put your money. It seems to be the short version of that message.
Yes, think of where you put your money, but mostly find people who are willing to really fight these big financiers. The fossil fuel divestment movement is instructive here. We began it, Naomi Klein and I really kind of launched it, and we did it on the assumption that most people don't have a coal mine or an oil well in their backyard, but everybody is adjacent to a pot of money, a university endowment, a pension fund, a church fund, whatever it is. And so that's become true. And there have been 20,000 of these fights all over the world, and they've added up to this $40 trillion. We have the Pope demanding divestment and Queen Elizabeth divesting her funds. We have Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and the University of California. We have the Episcopalians and the Lutherans. We have giant pension funds from Holland to New York City and New York State to Quebec to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. The country of Ireland has now divested all their public accounts from fossil fuel. So it's a good example of how to try and put pressure on big systems to change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems to me that that's an issue that hasn't received enough attention in the last years, but it's starting to get a lot more attention. And I think this is really going to be one of those key areas where change can really happen. Divestment, putting pressure on the banks and other big investors to think green. A question that we haven't really touched on yet, but is also really big. The US made an announcement regarding assistance for developing countries. Climate change is here. We are already seeing the impacts. You started us off with a discussion of some of them. What can we do in terms of partnering with those that aren't as well off as countries like the US or here in Germany?
So there's two parts to this question, one of which will be important at Glasgow and the other will be sort of emerging onto the stage. The first is around this, and let's just begin by saying the absolute iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. It's incredibly unfair. The 4% of us who are Americans have produced more than 25% of the global warming gases that are in the atmosphere right now, heating up the planet. That should be in the back of our minds at all times. So the part that'll be in active discussion at Glasgow is around climate finance. That is providing funds to the global south from the global north to allow them to make this energy transition at speed, And in 2009, in Copenhagen, then US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton promised that there would be a flow of funds by 2020 amounting to $100 billion a year, north to south, to do this. This hasn't happened yet. And people are tired of waiting for it, and it will be very much in demand. Think of that as transition money. There's another category of money within the UN system that we haven't really even hardly begun to talk about at all. And that falls under the category of loss and damage. That's the term that people use. How do we compensate those parts of the world where it's too late to, where people are already losing their farms, where hurricanes are, destroying coastal settlements, where infrastructure's been, and the price tag is getting very large, and it'll get much larger still. That loss and damage will be discussed at Glasgow, and I think it'll become a dominant feature at the next COP, which will be in Africa a year from now.
Yeah, I guess that's going to be really important too, having a COP and the next COP in Africa and getting more of the perspective on the climate adaptation needs of many parts of the world. I think we're going to be running out of time soon, but we're here at the US Embassy, sort of, and we are, of course, very interested in transatlantic relations and the question of areas for cooperation. So Germany, I think, is considered one of the countries, or the European Union as a whole, that is taken climate change relatively seriously, although perhaps not enough when you think of the slow transport transition, or there's still a lot to do with the built infrastructure. But climate change is big on the agenda. Climate neutrality goal for 2050 here, actually 2045, it was moved up, and at the European level at 2050. What's the potential for the US and Europe and Germany to be partners in this transition as opposed to competitors?
Well, I think that's a good way to put it. And I think that there's a lot of possibility. A good deal of this is technologically based, and we need easy technology transfer to make it possible to accelerate. And we also need, there's some things that are happening in Europe that are very helpful in general. A Dutch court ruled earlier this year that Shell had to cut its emissions 45% by the end of the decade. That was really powerful. If that holds up as it goes through the European court system, that sends a serious shockwave through everything, because it re-scrambles what financiers are expecting, and what it helps accelerate things. That's what needs to happen at this point. Look, I'm afraid I don't mean this to sound cynical in the least, but I think at this point it's pretty clear that governments are followers, not leaders, in this fight. That what really is important is that civil society in the US and the EU continue to unite and push really hard. And when we do that, we're able to make serious change. So that's why we work really hard to try and build bridges around what's happening with central banks across Europe and then in the US as well. That's where much of the pressure is going to come on the Biden administration post Glasgow, for instance. These are places where we can leverage for quicker change, and governments and the political currents that rule them. Those are the things that activists have to be good at pushing. Our job to some degree is to just keep resetting the zeitgeist over and over and over again. So there's never a kind of moment of rest for policymakers, so that they have to continue to adapt to a clear and ever increasing demand for change from the public.
Well, I like to stay positive. It's a huge, huge challenge that we have ahead of us, but we are starting to see some action. And I'd like to ask you in the last few minutes we have here to perhaps say a last couple of words to a primarily young audience that is here. What should this group of people think of? What should they be doing?
Well, first of all, young people are providing the leadership here, so many thanks. And you know, that makes sense because you're going to have to live your lives on, I'm going to be dead before the very worst of this kicks in, but you aren't. And so it makes sense that you're providing powerful leadership. I do think it would be super useful to keep reminding your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents that they need to have your back in this regard, and not letting them get off with the idea that your generation will solve the problem. It's going to take a big, quick, multi-generational effort to get us started on the trajectory we need to be on. I wish I could tell people that if we did everything right at this point, everything was going to come out all right. Everything's not going to come out all right. I mean, once you've melted the Arctic and so on, you've guaranteed yourself a good deal of pain. But the rising of a movement large enough to really start shifting that zeitgeist gives us some hope that we can keep things, we can move quickly enough to keep things from getting entirely out of control. And so I would be honest and tell you if I thought we were at the moment to kind of despair and give up. And I don't think we're there yet. It's possible that day may come, but it's also possible that we'll be able to keep moving just fast enough to keep some kind of useful endpoint in sight. That's the goal, I think, at this point.
Well, I think for our young people, you've provided an awful lot of really important messages. And I think that the work that you've done since you got launched in this area in the late 1980s has really been remarkable. I think most young people would love to have lived the life that you've lived until now and had the kind of impact that you have had. Really, really a remarkable resume. We're about the same age. You're 3 years older than I am, and I've looked at what you have accomplished, and all I can say is, wow. And yesterday I talked with my sister who lives in Seattle, and she said, oh, wow, Bill McKibben, he's a rock star. So you've really inspired many, many people. Congratulations on all that you've done. And we really look forward to hearing more and seeing how your next initiatives, including the third act, develop.
Miranda, thank you for all your good work and for very, very good questions. This has been a lot of fun, and many thanks to the consulate too for making this happen and for all their good efforts on behalf of all of us back here in the States.
So thanks very much and take care.
Take care, y'all.
Good luck in Glasgow.
Thank you.